Hi there, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful Father's Day yesterday. I know I got to spend some good quality time with my wife and son yesterday. Today's project is going to be about some things that I made for my dad.
1, 2, 3.
So yeah, I made a couple of picture frames. I actually made 3. I made one for my father-in-law, one for my father, and one for my mother-in-law, all as kind of like Father's Day, Mother's Day gifts. So yeah, I made some custom picture frames. We put pictures of my son in there with all the grandparents, and we gifted them all to the grandparents yesterday. So yeah, let's talk about how I made these picture frames a little bit. So picture frames are one of these notable projects that is a lot more complicated than it seems. Picture frames seem like it should be fairly simple. You're just making a frame, a box, you're making 45 degrees, whatever. Maybe you're doing some special joinery. We're not going to be doing any special joinery with this. This is just to make the frame itself. So yeah, let's jump right into it and talk about some of the reasons this is a little more complicated than it might seem. Okay, so the first thing is I went to the local lumber store. I happened to have one just down the street from the shop here and got some alder wood. It was relatively cheap. It was perfect. It was the shade that we were looking for. My wife had the idea of these picture frames, and I, of course, blurted out that, oh yeah, I can make that. So here we are making these frames. So I went to the store, I got some alder wood. I got enough to make what I thought was gonna make one frame really, and ended up getting wood to make 5. So these are the first 3 that I gifted, and then I'll have 2 others at some point. Maybe we'll do some fancy stuff with those. We'll see. So I wanted a really good edge because I knew I was going to have to rip down this alder wood to make the actual frames. The frames were only going to be about 1 inch thick. So I needed to rip those down. I needed a clean edge to rip from, though. I needed a reference edge. So I took my alder wood, I sent it through the joiner to get one really flat edge, and then ripped our 1.5 inch strips out of the piece of alder wood. Now, for picture frames, you want your pieces to be as flat as humanly possible, and you need all of your pieces to be exactly the same width. So what that means is that it's really ideal to just go ahead and make really long strips and then cut them to the sizes that you need after you rabbet the countersink for the glass. Now, rabbeting, grooves, routing, okay, so all this sort of stuff. I'll walk you through it. So we take our really long pieces, we flatten them out. I had one strip that ended up being slimmer than the others because even though it came from the same board, for some reason it ended up being bowed a little bit. So I had to stick that one through the planer a couple more extra times to get it perfectly flat. Now that I've got all 3 pieces, it's time to do the rabbet joint. Now, this is not like Little Bunny Foo-Foo. This is rabbet with 2 T's, and doing a rabbeting joint gives us the countersunk edge for the glass, the picture, the matting, the whatever you put inside of your picture frame. So we take the entire piece, one long strip, and we go ahead and use a router bit to do a rabbet joint. Now, I started doing this with a table saw. I've seen people do it with a table saw, but I had issues doing it on the table saw. The first thing I did was I tried using a feather board, but I could just never quite get it the way I needed to, whether it was because I needed a new blade or not, whether because I was using the wrong hold downs, what have you. I just found it a lot easier to use a rabbeting router bit on my router table and just rabbet the whole thing across, and it took 5 seconds. So now that we've got that across the entire strip, we can start making our 45-degree cuts on the miter saw. Now, a really cool trick that I learned from another YouTuber is to make an extra fence for your miter saw so that you can write and like draw where the rabbet part of the frame actually needs to end. So when you're cutting, you can actually line up where the rabbet meets, because your glass or your picture or whatever is going to be 5x7, 8x10, whatever, and you need to get that measurement right, not necessarily the outer or inner dimensions of the frame itself. It's kind of weird, but that's the way it is, and that's one of those things that really can screw you up if you're making a frame and you cut all your pieces and then try to rabbet, as if the rabbet is too deep, not deep enough, what have you. Can cause a lot of issues. And personally, I took a lot of math in college. I don't need to be doing that much math doing carpentry. So I went ahead and built my little jig. I just had 2 pieces of white scrap laying around. This was, I think, Formica, and I was able to draw on it pretty quickly, pretty easily with a pencil. So I screwed it down in my Makita miter saw. I made my marks for an 8-inch and a 10-inch cut. So I was able to draw right on the extra fence. And also, because I'm using an extra piece, I basically have a 0 clearance insert now where the new fence has been placed. Now the real trick here is getting your miter gauge to be exactly 45 degrees. This can be kind of tricky. Even with the really nice miter saws out there, it is very rare that a miter saw's little indentation mark for 45 degrees is exactly 45 degrees. That is like near impossible. So I make a couple of test cuts, I put them together, and by some miracle, they actually end up being 45 degrees. So with that done, I start cutting out the 8-inch, but not really 8-inch, and 10-inch, but not really 10-inch parts of the frame. Again, I'm referencing where the rabbiting part of the joint ends, not the exterior or inside dimensions of the frame. Now that I've got all that done, I can start taking the pieces and putting them together. So to make this a little easier, I took some blue painter's tape and put it across each joint. So there's a layer of tape, and then each part was on top of the tape, and I was able to fold it into the frame shape and then put a frame clamp around it. Yes, they make specific frame clamps. I wouldn't recommend doing this with standard clamps, just because the frame can bow a little bit, it can get a little messy, and you're not gonna get a really solid hold. I always recommend these straps. They sell them at Harbor Freight. For goodness sake, just go get a frame clamp. Now we just wait for that to dry. Now, because I'm making these as gifts, of course, I have to laser engrave them. We have access to diode lasers here at Sanctuary, so I'm going to take the measurement of how thick the frame is. I'm going to take it up to the laser engraver and laser engrave little messages for each frame. Once they're all done, I take it off and I do one last little hand sanding. Now, there's a trick with diode lasers that I learned, is that they leave a little bit of like ash behind, and sometimes you wipe your fingers across it and it'll like make black marks all across it. So I actually like to wash these out a little bit. I know there may be some discrepancies, or somebody saying you're doing that wrong or you shouldn't do that or something like that, but for the sake of the laser engraving coming out really nice and clean, I do like to wash and soak the frames, and I did, and they turned out just fine. And so I did that, I washed them out, and I hand sanded them to 500 grit. Once I hand sanded them, I let them dry, put in the glass, matting, the picture, and that's it. They're good to go. I know my family really enjoyed these frames as gifts, as well as the pictures inside them, of course. I hope you enjoyed this video. You learned something. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and get out there and make something awesome.